warm, soft rains and the smell of the ground, and swallows circling with their shimmering sound, and frogs in the pool singing at night, and wild plum trees in tremulous white. Robins will wear their feathery fire, whistling their whims on a low fence wire, and not one will know of the war, not one will care at last when it is done. Not one would mind, neither bird nor tree, if mankind perished utterly, and spring herself, when she woke at dawn, would scarcely know that we were gone. Sarah Teasdale, 1918. We've spent years wrapped in a comforting cocoon from the 1990s on, where the worries of nuclear war seem like something we've surmounted and overcome, with brief blips from negotiations in Iran and actions in North Korea, and one very close call between India and Pakistan in 2001 that in retrospect has been greatly overshadowed by the events of 9/11 and the subsequent war on terror. But the thing about human nature and ever more lethal weapons is that there is always someone who is ready to use them. And so here we are in 2025 on the brink of 80 years since the first and only use of nuclear weapons in war, with a recent Atlantic Council survey of experts showing that 40% expected a world war in the close future and 48% expecting use of nuclear devices by someone somewhere. If that poll seems depressing, the mood of the general non-expert public doesn't make for better reading. If anything, non-experts believe even more strongly that we're either on the path to or already in the early stages of a world war. And nuclear weapons will feature as a part of it. Most openly, Germany and Poland have signaled that they may be ready for their own nuclear weapons to protect their safety. But Saudi Arabia and Turkey have both hinted that they'll arm up as well if Iran goes any further with its nuclear program. And those are just the countries willing to talk about nuclear weapons programs openly. Behind the scenes, there's far more chatter. There's no way we can cover the history of nuclear weapons in a 15 to 20 minute History She Wrote episode. But we can hit a few key points. We all know about the use of the US atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We all know that the Soviet Union tested its first atomic weapon on August 29, 1949 in Kazakhstan. And it's pretty openly understood that they were able to test so soon because of spies within the US Manhattan Project, passing them detailed information. In fact, the Manhattan Project spies, the people the Rosenbergs were passing information to the Soviets on behalf of, probably shortened Soviet bomb development time by about 2 years. But it was not only Manhattan Project spies helping the Sovs along. Although Operation Paperclip, the United States use of Nazi scientists to further research, is well known and commonly discussed, the Soviets had their own program of appropriating the scientists and research of the Fuhrer after World War II. Initially, in 1945, a group of leading German scientists approached themselves the Soviet leaders, offering their services and expertise in return for three things: protection from prosecution for their past politics, no plundering of German scientific institutions, and a guarantee that their work would continue. The agreement was struck, and scientists, their families, their apartments, and their entire laboratories were transported wholesale into isolated areas of the Soviet Union in what is called the Soviet Alsos operation. As one report put it, the scientists were brought in not entirely voluntarily, but without physical pressure. Physical pressure came into the situation 1 year later, on October 22nd, 1946, when more than 6,000 scientists, technicians, and family members were transported to the Soviet Union in the dead of night during Operation Osoviekim. They came between midnight and 3 a.m. when everybody was asleep. They knew exactly where I lived, first of all. They had a key. They had everything to the apartment, to the door. There was one interrogator who told me, "Get up, you're being mobilized to work in Russia." And there were about half a dozen soldiers with machine guns who surrounded me, said Fritz Karl Prickshot, who was transported to the Soviet Union for 6 years. The urgency could perhaps be explained by the fact that two of the most necessary leading Soviet scientists for the nuclear and rocket programs had to be located in the gulags they had been disappeared to during Stalin's purges. It turns out that purging your best and brightest scientists doesn't exactly help you obtain nuclear weapons goals, or any scientific goals for that matter. The Sovs did not keep their scientist kidnappings to their own sectors of Germany either. Some were taken from Great Britain's area of responsibility. And when confronted with this, the Sovs insisted that all the scientists and technicians went to the Soviet Union voluntarily and on legitimate work contracts. The third country in the Nuclear Weapons Club was Great Britain. The UK had been a part of the Manhattan Project, which had merged with their own alloyed tubes program and research initiative in 1943. After dropping Fat Man and Little Boy in Japan, the US began to back away from nuclear partnerships, however. The special relationship between the US and the UK suddenly seemed not quite so special. The British believed that they needed their own nuclear program rather than relying on the goodwill of the United States for protection.
Britain fires its first H-bomb to join the United States and Russia as ranking atomic powers. The thermonuclear device was fired high over its target in the Christmas Islands, keeping fallout at a minimum. But the test added heat to the mounting debate over the safety of atomic tests, and came to on the eve of renewed disarmament talks between Russia and the West. With a limitation on further atomic tests increasing in possibility, Britain has staked its claim to full status as a nuclear world power, perhaps none too soon.
In his autobiography, former Prime Minister Clement Attlee wrote about this exact decision. At that time, we had to bear in mind that there was always the possibility of the US withdrawing and becoming isolationist again. The manufacture of a British atom bomb was therefore, at that time and stage, essential to our defense. You must remember that this was all prior to NATO. NATO has altered things, but at the time, although we were doing our best to make the Americans understand the realities of the Europe situation, the world situation, we couldn't be sure we'd succeed. In the end, we did, but we couldn't take any risks with British security in the meantime. Attlee's statement could very nearly apply to today's foreign policy world as well. Everything old is new again. Next on the dock in the nuclear club was France, who tested their weapon in the Algerian desert on February 13, 1960, causing Charles de Gaulle to triumphantly exclaim, "Hooray for France! Since this morning she's stronger and prouder." France had been pushed into the nuclear world by the events of the Suez Crisis. And it wasn't just France. As a part of the agreement signed with Israel before the Suez invasion in 1956, France agreed to construction of an Israeli reactor at Dimona. France also involved Israeli scientists in their nuclear research and as observers to their testing. China became number 5 in the nuclear club in 1964, but the next nuclear power has never admitted their capability in public. It is likely that Israel had the ability to project nuclear weapons since before the 1967 Six-Day War. The non-aligned nations maintained a very robust and anti-nuclear policy, but behind the scenes, things were far more complicated. India, one of the founders of the non-aligned nations, had a vibrant nuclear research program, which culminated in their test on May 18, 1974, Operation Smiling Buddha. This pushed Yugoslavia, whose nuclear program began post-World War II and had halted for a few years in the late 1960s, to restart their own research. And of course, Pakistan took notice as well. In short order, Pakistan also had nuclear weapons, as well as apartheid South Africa. South Africa, in particular, came under scrutiny in 1979 when an observed flash in the Indian Ocean was picked up by instrumentation. It is believed to have been a nuclear test, likely a joint effort between South Africa and Israel, which wasn't hidden as well as planned. As more nations gained weapons access, more worrisome incidents began to occur. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 has been the subject of stories, books, TV series, and movies. But often obscured in the retelling is an account of what was happening at the same time, namely, several high-altitude nuclear tests by both the Soviets and the Americans. In a world on the brink of nuclear war, there was little bureaucratic resolve to stop scheduled tests, or perhaps the tests remained to make a point. A test that occurred just a few months earlier by the US, called Starfish Prime, was so powerful that it was seen as an aurora as far away as Australia and New Zealand, destroyed satellites, even those out of line of sight, and caused 300 streetlights in Hawaii to simultaneously burn out. The Soviet test during the missile crisis fused together telephone lines in a 350-mile radius and burned out 620 miles of buried power cables. It's also credited with starting a power plant fire in Karaganda. And then there was the 1968 crash in Greenland of a nuclear-armed US B-52. It wasn't on the scale of testing nukes while in a nuke crisis, but explaining away a nuclear detonation to a country that had a nuclear-free policy was a bit more than awkward, to say the least. And although by the 1981 strike by Israel on the Iraqi Osirak reactor created worldwide condemnation, it was not the first strike on that reactor. Not only was the reactor struck by Iran in September 1980, but Iran and Israel were working together to disable this site altogether. It's a very in-your-face illustration of just how often international politics can resemble middle school social cliques. Just more mass death consequences. Thanks to President Eisenhower, the United States began a program in the 1950s called Atoms for Peace, aimed at allowing other nations to get nuclear power without the weapons. A plethora of organizations were created to police this paradigm, including the now constantly referenced IAEA. It is no secret, however, at least now, that an awful lot of the participating peaceful use nations were also looking for ways to weaponize. Iran's nuclear program actually dates back to Atoms for Peace, and Even Sweden participated with an eye to self-defense via deterrence. Switzerland had a nuclear program as well, one which, in a very Swiss manner, was voted on by their citizens multiple times. There was a lot of talk about nuclear nonproliferation, but behind the talk was an actual emphasis on everyone getting in on the nuclear game. Until the Soviet bloc began to fall, which was a geopolitical earthquake that changed everything. Suddenly, the world seemed less threatening. South Africa willingly dismantled its nuclear program. Both Belarus and Ukraine agreed to transfer Soviet nukes stationed in their respective nations back to Russia. With the exception of Iran and North Korea, nuclear weapons research took a back seat as the world assumed that we were all past that stage of human development. In 2025, that decision seems almost painfully naive. There are currently 8 declared nuclear states and one which has neither confirmed nor denied their nuclear status. In addition, there are states which are practically nuclear states in that it would be very quick work to switch from peaceful nuclear applications to weapons. One nation achieved nuclear weapons and dismantled them, and many states have their own brilliant scientists who have worked in the nuclear industry and can repurpose their knowledge at home into robust nuclear weapons programs if so asked. And there is the center of much of today's nuclear discussion, Iran. The world is in a huge state of turmoil and flux. It's precisely these moments when everything changes. The truth of those changes is that they're really never all of a sudden. They tend to grow and evolve slowly and almost imperceptibly until a critical tipping point throws everything over the edge. Right now, we're at the nuclear edge, and everything is beginning to tip. Of course, in our brief discussion here on History, she wrote, we barely scratched the surface of the history of nuclear proliferation, and we didn't at all get into what that means for the future. As a history-based company, predictions aren't our vibe. But to look forward at all in any way, we must all have a grounding in and an understanding of the past. Please continue to research, continue to read, find reputable sources, take books off the shelf, and build your understanding. There are too many in the world who don't bother.
What to do